Welcome back. Today we've been discussing Sarasota County's Hurricane Irma After Action Review with former FEMA Administrator Craig Fugate. We're joined now by Sarasota County Administrator Jonathan Lewis. Jonathan, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me here today. So Craig, now that the review's done, what do you think of Sarasota County's performance?
Well, again, I think if you look at what you did, I think sheltering 20,000 people when the most you'd ever sheltered before was 2,000 was pretty much a phenomenal response. You had challenges and you overcame that, and I think that's a real testament to the team that you guys have built here. But we did find areas that we can improve upon, particularly as we focus on the citizens and how to simplify our processes for them.
You know, Craig, that's a really good point that you make there. You know, as we looked at Irma approaching Category 4, we implemented all of our action plans, our comprehensive emergency management plan. And I think as we look back in this process, our goal is to identify, as you said earlier, what would we do different the next time? What can we enhance, and how would we respond differently in a future storm? So let's talk about some of the specific recommendations that you and the peer reviewers have developed to streamline the way we get folks to take action, to evacuate when those evacuation orders come out. So why don't we talk a little bit about sheltering and some of the discussion you mentioned earlier about opening shelters at the same time and some of the communication that we should do as we open shelters.
Well, the first thing we all agreed to is we want to make sure the shelters are survivable when a hurricane threatens the county. We were lucky Irma didn't hit, but we got to be very careful that we don't select shelters based upon shorter distances that are not safe. We got to go to the safe shelters. Then the second thing is people need to know where their shelters are before the storm gets there. So pre-identifying the pre-landfall storm shelters, making sure people know where those are at so they can plan if they're going to shelter, and making them as accessible and inclusive to everybody in the community. So whether you have pets or you have a disability, you're not having to go to a specific shelter, you're going to your closest shelter.
You know, that's a great point. So many of us have pets in our family, and they're our family. And so as we identified through the activation of this storm, all of our shelters ended up taking in pets. And I think that's an important part of what we look at in enhancing our operations. Let's talk a little bit about medically dependent and what that means and what type of recommendations you found there.
Well, again, we were using terminology, and it's actually in Florida legislation, but it's kind of dated from Hurricane Andrew. We call people special needs. And that tended to categorize people with a variety of issues, many of which should have been able to go to a regular shelter. People with disabilities should not be segregated away from their families. And I think that's one of the things we really wanted to look at was how do we distinguish people who may have a disability, but their needs can be met in a regular shelter. And somebody may have a medical need that's going to be above that standard level of care, not because they have a disability, but because they have a medical care. And then focusing on those folks, both in our planning, but also in our sheltering operations to minimize who would have to go to a hospital if they evacuated.
That's a great point as we talk about, you know, folks that may need oxygen dependent while they're in a shelter and having the ability to provide that service to them. And you know, one of the things we look at when we talk about special needs in this storm and medically dependent was the amount of registrants that we had in the days leading up to the storm, over 800 in the few days right before the storm. So I think some of the recommendations we talk about there are getting information out to residents and getting them registered early in some of those components.
As much as we can, we also have to figure that a certain percentage of our population are going to have these needs. So whether you register or not, that's what we have to plan for.
Right. You mentioned something about evacuation center locations, which is what we're moving to calling our shelters now, being geologically diverse across the county. That can be a little bit tricky for us as we talk about some of the lower lying areas on the southwest coast of Florida that start in the Venice area. So let's talk a little bit about the requirements for a safe evacuation center.
The first and number one issue is you've got to be out of the storm surge area. That is the most deadly part of a hurricane, is why we evacuate. And we need to make sure that our shelters are located high and dry. That's one of the challenges. Although we didn't see a lot of storm surge with Irma, people are looking at areas that in a landfalling hurricane such as Irma would have had feet of water and potentially life-threatening water levels in these shelters. So our first goal is to make sure the shelters are physically safe, that they're elevated away from the high surge areas. And then the second consideration is that they are able to withstand the hurricane force winds.
Really comes down to what we talk about: run from wind, run from surge and hide from wind.
Yeah, I mean, the whole idea that we do evacuations is not for the wind threat, except for manufactured housing, things like that. Our primary risk is storm surge, and that's why the barrier islands, those coastal communities, all the inlets. And this is the other thing we learned. We've been referring to these as zones, expecting people to know what zone they're in, and then trying to communicate that. Well, if I'm a recent arrival or I'm not really sure, that kind of got confusing. So the other thing we talked about was simplifying our evacuation orders and talk about geographical locations. If you're saying evacuate Longboat Key, don't talk about zone 1 and 2. Just say evacuate everybody in Longboat Key. And give people references that make sense, like highways and other things that are common references that people understand. Again, I think the better we tell people who are at risk that need to evacuate clearly what that risk is, the better the compliance is to get them to move to higher ground.
Absolutely. Jonathan, you've worked in municipalities and most recently Northport City Manager. You were instrumental in keeping the lines of communication clear and open and talking with Northport and county cities throughout the event of Irma. Tell us about how essential that is.
Well, without those clear lines of communication, what the opportunity is not just for the municipalities and the county and other governments to get confused, but it leads for the opportunity for our residents who are trying to protect and get the safety for them to get confused. It's just fundamental for part of the service we're supposed to be providing as public employees is how to protect people. One of the easiest things we can do is communicate with each other.
You know, that's an awesome point. And staying along the lines of communication, let's talk a little bit about issuing evacuations prior to the storm and the all clear after the storm. So citizens know what's going on. And we recognize there were some opportunities for enhance in the future there. Can we talk a little bit about your red, green, yellow concept?
Yeah, after the storm hits, people want to try to get back to their homes, and there's various levels of impact and levels of safety considerations. And I think too often we try to control this by saying you can't go back, and people want to go back. So I think what we looked at is perhaps instead of fighting that, let's give people the information they need that if they're going back, the relative level of safety and capabilities to support them. So if you're in a green area, you can go back. There may be some impacts, but pretty much you're safe going back. Yellow, there may be limited services, probably still don't have safe water, delayed response. And a red zone would be one without any infrastructure or support. Likelihood of response would be significantly delayed. You're really going back at your own risk. And you're probably, if you're going back, shouldn't be planning on staying there. Just go back secure, get what you can, and get out of there. But being able to give people more information so they can make informed decisions instead of trying to blanketly tell people you can't go back, knowing most people want to get back. And if we can get them back safely and they can secure their property, we actually speed up our recovery.
That's a great point, and we're actively looking how we're going to implement that into our system. Let's talk a little bit about addressing government closures before and after the storm. Jonathan, what did we learn there?
I think what we learned, certainly as coming out of the after action, but I think what we learned is that we need to be clear, concise, and make that decision on the front end. And I think that is a great lesson to be learned for the time where we do have a hurricane actually hit here.
John, what final thoughts would you have as it relates to this after action process and Craig and for our citizens?
Well, the first thing is that we're here to serve the community in emergencies. And that's what our emergency management teams, both in the county and our cities, are structured to do. And I think this report gives us all the opportunity to be better at it for the future. And with that, I just want to thank Craig for his bringing his expertise to make all of us here in Sarasota County better. But I also want to mention that we couldn't have done this without a couple of our foundations. The Charles and Marjorie Barancik Foundation and the Gulf Coast Community Foundation were crucial to helping us get to this point in the after action in the peer review. So I just want to make sure we've thanked them as well.
Thank you, Jonathan. As hurricane season approaches, citizens will see many of these recommendations implemented as we enhance and refine our plans. Our team will be providing information on hurricane evacuation center locations, transportation plans, medically dependent shelter registration, and much more. You can stay up to date on these changes by following us on Facebook at Sarasota County Government and on Twitter at SRQ County Gov, and by visiting our website, scgov.net. Thank you, Jonathan and Craig, for joining me, and thank you for watching. stay safe.